is a body. Rain poured from the high spire of the chapel, flowing down its blackened eaves in rivulets that gleamed like quicksilver in the half-light. Gargoyles shaped as tormented saints and penitent martyrs spewed torrents from their mouths into the flooded street below, their stone eyes worn smooth by centuries of prayer and acid rain. It was the early cycle of Nitwortha's Laotnet, the long night that would grip the world for half a standard year. The sky had not known true dawn in months, and the rain had been unceasing since the sun's last dim retreat. The cobbled ways of the ecclesiarchal quarter were sodden and slick, the gutters choked with incense ash and votive candles washed down from the shrines above. Through this deluge trudged a solitary figure. His robe, once the gray of humble penance, now clung dark and heavy to his form. Bare feet slapped against the cold stones, his sandals had long since come apart in the mire. He moved quickly, furtively, glancing over his shoulder with the hunted eyes of one who had reason to fear being followed. Lightning illuminated the spire for an instant, casting the city's bones in stark relief. Iron chimneys and glass reliquaries, gilded domes streaked black by industry, and far off the silhouette of Fiskbola's forge lights, high in orbit, pulsing red. A servo skull, ancient and pitted with corrosion, disengaged from its roost under the chapel eaves. Its optic lenses flared ruby as it descended, trailing incense vapor from its exhaust vents. It hovered above the approaching penitent, scanning him with a mechanical whine before projecting a halo of pale lumen light to guide his path. From its crown unfolded a battered umbraculum, creaking as it deployed against the rain. The man looked up, lips moving in silent thanks. Whether the emperor heard him, or whether the machine spirit did, was beyond knowing. He reached the great doorway of the minor ecclesiarchy annex, a structure dwarfed by the spire it served, but still monumental in its own right. Raising his trembling hand, he traced the sign of the Aquila across his chest, murmuring a short benediction. The servo skull, now hovering beside the lintel, rotated its ocular array to the embedded prayer sensorium, a half-mechanical icon of the emperor's face. The machine's logic spirit processed the gesture, and with a deep, resonant groan, the oak doors shuddered open. They were heavy, age-darkened panels bound in iron, their surfaces carved with the faces of heroes and martyrs, some beatific, others twisted in the agony of their last breath. Candlelight spilled from the crack between them, mixing with the rain and casting shimmering reflections across the flooded street. The figure slipped inside, shoulders hunched, as the servo skull retracted its umbraculum with a delicate hiss. Its lumen dimmed to a dull amber glow, and it emitted a soft mechanical sigh before ascending to its perch once more. The doors boomed shut behind him like a coffin being sealed, drowning the sound of the storm outside. Inside, the only noise was the distant drip of water from his robe onto the marble floor, and the slow, mechanical turning of the chapel's great cogitator bell, counting down the hours until matins. The chapel was a small one, overseen by a lay preacher recently arrived from Incaloris. It was Broadmouthieport's only surviving ecclesiarchy building. The once grand wooden monastery complex that had stood beside it was burned to ruin during the war. Only this stone chapel, blackened and scarred by flame, had endured the firestorm and the years since. Though the Adeptus Ministorum had promised to rebuild, funds were slow in coming. The coffers of the faithful were thin, and the tithes from the Mechanicus were strained by ceaseless reconstruction across Nitwortha's scarred surface. The ecclesiarchy here survived mostly on the goodwill of the people, and on the gracious charity of Archmagus Damiavoratrix, who was, despite her station in circuitry, a declared patron of the God-Emperor's servants. Deacon Absalon stood beneath the vestry arch, the dim lumen glow outlining his thin, sharp features. Scrolls and parchment sheets lay in disarray across his small reading stand. The desk lamp beside him was inoperative, its machine spirit long dormant, awaiting the attentions of some minor tech adept who would never come. The lumen set high above the arch flickered fitfully, casting shifting shadows that made the saintly murals along the wall seem to breathe. It was Laotnit, and lumens were in short supply this far into the long half-year of darkness. The chapel's power allocation had been reduced again by the administratum, and Absalon had learned to ration light as carefully as faith. This was not his parish by choice. His old church at Hill, overlooking the Ethelflod River, had been a place of song and sunlight. Here in Broadmouthport, the sea was a black mirror, and the wind smelled of rusted salt and machine oil. The town was small, a huddled coil of shanties clinging to the edge of the old docks. He turned a scroll in his hand. The seal bore the waxen cog of Fiskport's foundry congregation, a request for the blessing of a newly rebuilt hall. Another scroll beneath it contained a request for prayers for a youth bound for the Wise Air Academia, his parents seeking divine favor for a safe voyage through the storms. He smiled faintly at their hope. Faith endured, even in shadow. The next scroll was from Silthdale, a birth naming for a blacksmith's seventh child. The parchment smelled faintly of oil and soot. Absalom sighed softly. Others in his station might have passed such trifles to an underdeacon, but he was a dutiful man. Each plea mattered. The sound of the chapel doors closing drew his gaze up. The noise was a dull, coffin-like thud, echoing through the nave. Candles along the aisle gutters flickered, some extinguishing in a ripple of dying light that sent pale smoke drifting like incense through the air. A servitor, entombed in an alcove, awoke with a jerking motion. Its optics glowed red, its gait uneven as it shambled forth to relight the candles. Each movement set its augmetic joints squealing faintly, like a lament. Through the widening darkness, Absalom saw a man entering, shuffling, stooped, the rain still dripping from his robe. The newcomer's scalp was shaven, revealing pale flesh marked with faint lines of circuitry. A single augmetic eye whirred softly as it adjusted to the light. The rest of him was all too human. Mud-caked hem, threadbare robes of mechanicus red, and the unmistakable smell of wet metal and oil. At first glance, he might have passed for a dock worker or servitor wrangler, but there was something more in his bearing. The faint hesitation of ritual, the way his lips moved in whispered prayers. Not the harsh cant of Mars, but the softer broken syllables of a man who remembered faith. Upon seeing the deacon, he fell to his knees, splashing water onto the flagstones. His voice trembled with urgency and fear. "Lord Deacon, I expected Preacher Tordick. I did not mean to disturb your eminence with trifling affairs," he said, the tone refined but the words rasped raw by exhaustion. Absalom crossed to him, setting aside the scrolls on a gilded footstool. "How can the ministorum serve you, my son?" he asked gently. The man looked up. His unaugmented eye, a soft, mortal brown, met Absalom's. It was not the gaze of a Worthen. He was a foreigner, almost certainly an off-worlder. "Forgive me," the man stammered, lowering his head again. "I come from Grimness. I am newly arrived, by freight barge. There was trouble. His words broke apart. Absalom nodded slowly. An immigrant, then. There had been many of late, fleeing the political purges and heretic uprisings of the Forge World Grimness. Such exiles had brought their fears and their fractures to Knitworth's shores. Even Preacher Tordick, the chapel's prior minister, had once fled his homeworld amid an ecclesiarchal schism. Such unrest was the echo of a greater storm. The Nova Terra Interregnum still shuddered through the Imperium, fracturing even faith itself. Absalom often thought of it as a sickness, the kind that spread unseen through hearts rather than bodies. "I fear Preacher Tordick is away on pressing business," Absalom explained. In truth, Tordick was mediating a cattle dispute at Aesersip's Hearth Hall, an affair unworthy of divine time, but Absalom had learned never to underestimate the mortal capacity for pettiness. "You may speak to me in his stead." The man shivered violently, his teeth almost chattering. The chapel was not cold. Indeed, the air was warmed by incense burners and wax flames. This was something deeper than chill. "Then, may I call upon your mercy?" he asked, the words almost pleading. Absalom studied him closely. The man's pallor, the tremor in his hands, he seemed stricken, either by guilt or terror. "What troubles you, child?" Outside, through the thick door, Absalom heard footsteps splashing through the rain, several sets, hurried and heavy. His servitor turned its head toward the sound, the lenses narrowing. The deacon's hand drifted to the bolt pistol at his belt, unbuttoning the clasp in a motion so smooth it might have been prayer. The mechanicus man looked up, panic in his eye. "Lord, there is a body." His voice cracked. "And they think I killed him." The words hung in the candlelit air. The doors slammed open with a thunderous crash that shook dust from the rafters. A storm gust followed in their wake. scattering candlelight and sending half the flames sputtering out. Smoke trailed upward in twisting ribbons, coiling around the rafters like incense offered to no god at all. 3 figures advanced through the downpour, Adeptus Arbites, their black carapace armor shining wetly beneath the lumen glow. Cloaks of heavy waxed leather dripped with rain and street filth. Each held a bolt pistol drawn, muzzles glinting in the dim light as the echo of their boots struck the stone floor. "There's the dog," barked the lead arbitrator, his vox grill amplifying the words into a mechanical snarl. "Grab him!" The man on the ground whimpered, flinching instinctively. His augmetic eye flickered with static. Deacon Absalon moved without haste, but with undeniable purpose, placing himself between the cowering man and the oncoming lawman. His hand rested lightly atop the supplicant's bald head, a gesture both protective and commanding. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. His voice was not raised, yet it carried the authority of faith, the kind of authority the Arbites, for all their power, were trained to fear. The man knelt still, shivering, whether from cold, fear, or shame, Absalon could not tell. His augmetic eye clicked as it adjusted to the gloom, the aperture contracting like the pupil of a frightened beast. Absalon studied him silently. There was desperation there, yes, but not the wild, cornered look of a guilty man. No criminal, certainly no murderer, would seek sanctuary in a church when the starport was less than half a day's walk east. A guilty man would have fled into the night, taken a cargo hold, begged a place aboard a tramp freighter or pilgrim hauler, vanished into the trade lanes. This man had come here. To him. A clever murderer might think of that too, of course, but Absalon had seen too many of both kinds in his life, the fearful and the damned. The fearful pleaded, the damned performed, and this man's fear was raw, clumsy, genuine. His hands trembled not merely with guilt, but with something deeper, accusation. That, Absalom thought, was what truly terrified him, not damnation, not even punishment, but the idea of being accused. There was something painfully human in that. He turned slightly, the folds of his robe whispering over the stone. The Arbites stood at the threshold, hesitant, their discipline masking unease. Absalom knew their kind, men bred to obey, trained to fear the chain of command more than the emperor's wrath. They would never dare to drag a suspect from his custody so long as he stood here, wrapped in his vestments and reputation like armor. He exhaled quietly. His authority, like most things in the Imperium, was a matter of perception. In truth, he did not outrank the Arbites. The Lex Imperialis was clear. Only an inquisitor, judge marshal, or high ecclesiarch could countermand the emperor's lawbringers. But Nitwertha was a frontier world. Frontiers bent rules, as surely as storms bent trees. He was no inquisitor, but he was known to be under the eye of Archmagos Demia Voratrix, and that was power enough for most to hesitate. The Archmagos valued him, or at least valued the appearance of valuing him. And more importantly, it was whispered that the Void Revenants themselves listened to his counsel, especially Skop Wulfgar, who had personally attended services at the spire of Suthihill. Such things made men tread carefully. He knew, of course, that power like that was a dangerous gift. It burned hotter the more it was used. Power is greatest when applied lightly, he reminded himself, recalling an old saying from his mentor. A hammer raised too often is soon taken away. Better to let others imagine the weight of the unseen hand behind him than to test how far it could truly reach. Let the Arbites believe that a single word from him could bring down Mechanicus' censure or a Thunderhawk's wrath. Belief was a finer weapon than proof. He glanced once more at the kneeling man. The adept's lips moved silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in calculation. "I am afraid, Lord," the man whispered at last, as if sensing the deacon's gaze upon him. Absalom's eyes softened, though his mind did not. Fear could be a kind of honesty, one that often revealed more than confession ever could. Outside, thunder rolled again over Broadmouthiport. He drew in a breath of cold, incense-tinged air and stepped into the storm. "Out of the way, priest," the Arbi's officer snapped, storming forward with the arrogance of jurisdiction. His tone faltered, however, when his eyes met Absalom's. Recognition flickered there, recognition and fear. The deacon's expression did not change, though his eyes hardened. "That would be get out of the way, deacon," he said, voice smooth as oiled steel. The officer's face paled. Yes, Lord Deacon, he stammered, his voice suddenly subdued. Behind him the two arbitrators hesitated, then dropped to one knee in reverence. Water pooled around their greaves, mingling with melted candle wax on the stones. Absalon's lips curved in a thin smile, though his eyes remained cold. You storm into the Emperor's house with loaded weapons, shouting like underhive enforcers, and without even an inquisitor's seal to justify your bluster. He folded his hands behind his back, tone almost conversational. Shall I vox Inquisitor Malinovska? I hear she's staying at Nitward Hall. I'm sure she'd be interested in hearing that the Arbites of Broadmouthport have taken to violating ecclesiarchal sanctity. I could even ask Skop Wolfgar to lend her a Void Revenant Thunderhawk. He's ever so obliging in matters of the faith. As he spoke, his personal servitor clanked forward from its alcove, its mechanical arms unfolding to activate a brass Vox transceiver. The soft click of its tuning wheels echoed ominously in the silence. The Arbit's officer swallowed hard, the bravado draining from his voice. Lord, we found a body. This man is suspected of being the guilty party. He gestured toward the kneeling Mechanicus adept without meeting Absalon's gaze. Verily, said the deacon, voice low and deliberate. Then, as he is merely a suspect, he shall remain a guest of the Adeptus Ministorum until such time as the truth is revealed. He tapped the ferrule of his staff lightly against the flagstones. We shall go and see what is to be seen. The Arbits hesitated, then bowed stiffly and stepped aside, allowing him to pass. Absalon re-engaged the safety on the bolt pistol concealed within his robes, the motion silent, practiced. He turned to the trembling visitor beside him. Fear not, child, he said, voice softening with an almost fatherly cadence. The truth will come to light, and the Emperor's justice will prevail. The Mechanicus adept bowed his head, gratitude and dread mingling in his eyes. Together they walked toward the great chapel doors. Absalon's servitor followed close behind, its sandal-like feet clicking against the marble, the soft whir of gears punctuating the steady rhythm of the deacon's staff. The Arbites opened the doors for them. Cold rain poured in, washing the incense smoke out into the night. Somewhere beyond the threshold, thunder rolled across the sea, a sound like distant gunfire, and the black waters of Nitwortha's coast whispered of darker things yet to come. The rain did not ease. It came down in relentless sheets, hammering the cobbled street until it shone like black glass beneath the guttering lumen strips. Each droplet hissed as it struck the cracked stones, running in rivulets toward the rusted gratings that lined the avenue. Deacon Absalon walked with measured calm, his robes gathered in one hand to keep the hem from dragging through the filth. Beside him trudged the fugitive, hunched and silent, his sodden red Mechanicus robes clinging to him like a penitent's shroud. His augmetic eye flickered in the rain, the optics fogging intermittently with moisture. Above them, a servo skull drifted smoothly, its small grav motors whining softly. It carried a battered umbraculum, which flickered with a faint power field that turned falling rain into glistening steam. The hovering shelter covered the deacon and his companion in a trembling halo of dry air, while the rest of the world drowned around them. The Adeptus Arbites walked in a loose semicircle, three dark shapes moving through the storm like predatory machines. Cloaks of oil-treated leather hung from their shoulders, rain sheeting off them in rivulets. One kept his pistol holstered, but his hand rested on the grip. Another swung his electromaul idly at low walls and bushes as they passed, sending sharp bursts of crackling light into the shadows. When a mangy dog nosed too close, it yelped and bolted into an alley with a wet splash. The fugitive flinched at the sound. Absalon did not. The street wound downward, lined by weather-worn habs and cracked statues of saints with blind eyes. Flickering devotional lights glowed behind grime-streaked windows. The smell of the sea and burning promethium mixed in the air, Broadmouthport's signature scent of salt, rust, and industry. Locals took notice as the procession passed. Some peered out from beneath the overhangs of their awnings, staring wide-eyed at the Arbites. A few turned sharply away, pretending to busy themselves with sweeping rainwater from their doorsteps or fastening shutters that didn't need fastening. Those born and bred in the town, the true Nitworthan folk, long hardened to strange sights, simply nodded as they passed. One or two even tipped their caps, wry smiles beneath dripping hats. The deacon returned their nods with serene composure. Authority was its own armor. Halfway down the street, they met a prelate from the next parish, a well-fed man in damp finery carrying a basket of stasis-sealed vegetables wrapped in devotional silk. The man's face lit up with recognition, then froze in alarm at the sight of the Arbite's escort. He stammered a greeting that died in his throat, thrust his basket into the hands of the nearest beggar, and hurried off, sandals slapping against the cobbles as he fled up the street toward the chapel. Absalom could not help but smile faintly. That would do nicely. Within minutes, the ecclesiarchal network would hum with whispers. The ministorum militia would know their deacon was being escorted by grim-faced lawmen, and subtle measures would begin at once. Doors opening, ears turning, old loyalties awakening. He adjusted his grip on his staff and straightened slightly, his pace gaining confidence. The rain continued to pour, unheeding, a cold and endless hymn to the planet's long night. But Absalom walked on as if the storm itself made way for him. The fugitive at his side glanced up, uncertain. The deacon only murmured a quiet benediction under his breath. "Walk in faith, my son. The emperor's eye is upon us, and upon those who would presume to test his servants." The Arbites said nothing. Their red visors gleamed faintly in the downpour, and their boots splashed in unison as they descended toward the docks, the sound swallowed by thunder and the distant tolling of a mechanicus shift bell. The Arbites led them off the cobbled road, down a narrower service path that wound toward the docks and the rail lines beyond. Rain continued to pour in unbroken sheets, hissing as it struck the rusted rails and puddled in the ruts between the sleepers. They crossed the railway tracks, the lamps along the line flickering fitfully in the wind, casting broken halos of light through the downpour. Absalom's boots splashed through the runoff, his robes already heavy with damp despite the servo-skull's best efforts. Above, the umbraculum trembled against the storm, its faint power field flickering as it strained to keep the deacon and his charge dry. The Arbites, encased in their black rain-slick coats, seemed unconcerned, water running in rivulets down their armor. One of them used his baton to push aside a loose section of fencing as they climbed the incline beyond the rails. The path ahead had been recently dug, the clay still soft and raw beneath their boots. The edges of the trench glistened with water, and the air smelled of wet soil and machine oil. Absalom recalled Wulfgar's words about the work underway here. The endless expansion of the Broadmuthiport line, new stations, new cranes, and new trade arteries for Neatwortha's southern coast. The deacon could almost hear the young Scop's voice in his memory. 2 cranes, deacon, vast ones. One for the ore trains, one for the mechanicus shipments. They'll shift entire cargo holds before morning tide. He presumed this was where they were headed now, to the unfinished yards, where the mud was still soft with the blood of laborers' hands and the emperor's sigil yet to be consecrated on the gateposts. He slowed slightly, allowing himself a feigned wince and tightening his grip on the staff. It was an old trick, that small pantomime of frailty. A deacon who limped seemed less threatening, more mortal, and mortals were underestimated. The Arbites paid him no mind. They had the look of men eager to be done with this duty, their thoughts on dry barracks and recaf. They passed a cluster of mechanicus adepts further along the ridge. The robed figures were half buried in the mire, directing servitors as they dug trenches and laid new cable lines. Glowing data slates flickered in the rain. One, an overseer with a bionic jaw and rank glyphs along his cowl, turned briefly toward the procession, his lenses narrowing. Absalom gave a faint nod beneath his hood. The adept turned away with studied nonchalance, but the deacon smiled inwardly. He knew what would follow. Even now, somewhere in the downpour, a runner would be dispatched to the woodland workshop of Magos Ductora Cogitatus Tiberius. The youth would dodge servitors and tread carefully past the Magos chained wargs, those terrible augmetic beasts that guarded his estate, before delivering word of the deacon's escort by the Arbites. From there, Absalom could picture the chain of events as if reciting a prayer. Doors being thrown open at Neatweird Hall, servants roused, alarms whispered into vox relays. The Void Revenants, perhaps Sinwolf's men, arming themselves and preparing inquiries of their own, And, far above, in orbit over the world, Archmagos Damia Voratrix herself turning toward a blinking red signal in her sanctum aboard Fiskbala Station. He smiled faintly beneath his cowl. It was good to have friends, he thought. Better still to be the kind of man whose friends moved without needing to be asked. The arbits ahead halted as the path curved down toward the rail yard. Through the curtain of rain, Absalon saw the faint orange glow of lumen flares, the silhouettes of cranes rising like iron saints over the half-built dock. Somewhere below, a bell was tolling, a deep, mechanical note that echoed through the storm. The fugitive shivered beside him. Absalon said nothing, only adjusted his grip on his staff and began the descent toward the light. Up ahead, two arbites stood atop a wide, mud-slick pipe that jutted from the ridge like the gullet of some buried machine beast. The rise was perhaps 30 feet high, cut sheer by recent excavation. Workers below were laying culvert lines, the pipes running like metal arteries beneath the sodden ground. Steam rose from their tools as rain hissed against hot iron. The arbites straightened at the sight of the approaching party. Their visors flared red for a moment in the gloom before one snapped a salute, exchanging a wary glance with his companion. The gruff spokesman, the same officer who had barked orders in the chapel, stepped forward and gestured into the dark opening. Deacon Absalon halted, planting the ferrule of his staff into the mud. He leaned slightly forward, peering into the gaping maw of the pipe. Its angle and shadow created an optical illusion, making it appear bottomless. Rainwater pooled inside, disturbed by the constant drip from above. The surface rippled like liquid glass under the faint light of the arbit's lumens. The deacon's servo skull hovered close, angling the umbraculum to shield him. The faint whine of its grav motor was the only sound beyond the endless hiss of rain. "Begging your pardon, sir, but—" the Arbites officer began. Absalon raised one finger without looking up. "It's Lord," he said softly, "or if you are a parishioner or of equal rank, Father will do." The officer hesitated, swallowing a curse. "Lord, then, Father." He cleared his throat. A local Wigathane patrol found a priest near the pipe's mouth. He was in a disturbed state and ran when they approached. They voxed for assistance once they looked inside. He gestured toward the trembling man behind Absalon, the Mechanicus adept, soaked and miserable. When we arrived, he was still nearby. He bolted when we tried to question him. We gave chase, and he pointed his lumen into the pipe. The beam cut through the dimness, glancing off rust-red metal ribs and the pale shapes tangled within. What had first appeared to be debris was unmistakably skeletal. Long bones draped with remnants of decayed cloth and strands of moss or seaweed. The corpse had the stillness of long neglect. Absalon stepped closer, his reflection rippling in the water. "The body is nothing but a skeleton," he said evenly. Yes," replied the Arbits a little defensively. "It's a body. Someone killed it. Him. Her." Absalon tilted his head. "So your conclusion is that this man," he gestured back to the cowering adept, "committed the act of homicide, then stripped the body, waited for it to decompose, and only now returned to admire his handiwork." The officer's jaw tightened. "With respect, Lord, I'm the expert in the detection of crime here." "Which," Absalon interjected, "still requires proof." The officer shifted, frowning behind his visor. "Our working hypothesis," he paused, as if savoring the word, "is that this fellow murdered the other and disposed of the body in the pipe to hide it. When the pipe was unearthed during excavation, he panicked and returned to destroy the evidence, which is when he was seen by the patrol. That's when he ran." Absalon regarded him for a long moment. The rain drummed on the umbraculum like soft applause. "I doubt this man had any part in it," the deacon said at last. The officer stiffened. "With respect, my lord, you are not trained in investigatory arts." Absalon ignored him. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and into the pipe. His boots slipped slightly on the wet iron, and one of the Arbites instinctively reached out to steady him. "Bless you, my child," the deacon murmured, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. Inside, the world narrowed to the echo of water and the hum of the servo skull above. The faint light of lumen beams danced across the interior walls, reflecting from patches of stagnant water and corroded filigree. Absalon crouched beside the remains. The bones lay half submerged, a rosary chain tangled between the ribs. The rain outside became a steady rhythm against the metal, a hollow, mechanical heartbeat. He reached out with his staff and gently lifted the pendant from the water. The gilded aquila had been worn smooth by years of friction. The inscription beneath it was still visible, though the letters were half erased. Absalon's lips moved silently as he read it. Then, softly enough that only the servo skull might have heard, he whispered, "Emperor, preserve us! This was no murder!" Crouching beside the skeleton, Deacon Absalon immediately noted the absence of any odor of decay. The air within the pipe was cold, metallic, sterile. Whatever this thing had once been, it had long since passed beyond corruption. He drew a narrow quill case from within his robe and, with practiced care, used its pointed tip to lift aside the clumps of slick seaweed and blackened vegetation tangled around the ribcage. Then, switching to his gloved hand, he brushed away layers of packed mud and leaves. A dull gleam caught the lumen light. He leaned closer. A polished silver skull emerged from beneath the debris, its surface engraved with circuit filigree and half-erased runes. "Metal skull," Absalon murmured. "Clearly a Mechanicus adept, Lord," replied the Arbites officer, crouching beside him. His tone carried a mixture of uncertainty and relief, glad, perhaps, to identify something tangible amidst the grim unknown. Absalon studied the remains in silence, his gloved fingers tracing the delicate ridges of augmentation along the spine and cranium. "Heavily augmented," he said softly. "Intricate work, Mechanicus designs, but not of any local forge I know." He tilted his head, examining the craftsmanship. "These markings, they are old, very old." The Arbites officer frowned. "We thought the same, Lord, but none of the local forges claim him. We've sent requests to Fiskballa Station, no response yet." Absalon looked up sharply. The officer's voice betrayed something, unease, perhaps recognition of the risk. A dead tech priest, especially one of rank, was a dangerous thing. The Mechanicus did not tolerate such mysteries. "How long since this was uncovered?" he asked. "Less than 2 hours, Lord," the officer replied. "The dig crews called it in immediately. We secured the site as per protocol." Absalon nodded absently, turning his gaze back to the skeleton. He brushed away more mud. The lumen beam caught faint etchings across the ribcage, runic inscriptions so fine they might have been carved by light itself. "Lumen closer," he said. The officer obeyed. Under the harsh white glare, the markings revealed themselves fully. They were unlike any standard Mechanicus inscriptions. No hexagrammatic purity seals, no binheric code. Instead, the symbols curved in flowing, asymmetric patterns, each stroke too organic, too deliberate. Absalon's brow furrowed. "These are not Martian, nor Lucian, nor even Merkovan patterning," he paused. "They look Eldari." The word tasted like blasphemy in the damp air. A chill ran through him despite the heat of his robes. Such things did not belong in imperial soil, much less beneath a chapel's shadow. He rose to his feet, stepping out of the pipe. Rain poured down again as the servo skull repositioned the umbraculum over him, shielding him in a small bubble of dry air. Beyond the ridge, the Ephenlioma shimmered faintly on the horizon, a curtain of auroral light that rippled across the black sky. To the north, Gaslioma pulsed intermittently, the sign of the Stormwaird's defense batteries discharging against the oncoming ocean tempest. The sea's distant roar merged with the thunder, a symphony of industry and storm. "How long has this pipe been here?" Absalon asked, his tone quiet but edged. The trembling priest wrung his hands. "I have no knowledge, Lord. It was here when I arrived." One of the younger Arbites offered, "Could be part of the Great Forge, Lord. The pipe runs north, same direction." Absalon turned toward the distant cliffs, though the forge itself lay hidden beyond the trees and the storm's veil. He ran a hand along the pipe's surface, scraping away grime. Beneath the rust, the metal gleamed with an unexpected luster. It wasn't plasteel, nor any standard ferroalloy. It shimmered faintly, like polished bronze with veins of copper fire. "This is no forge product," he said softly. He crouched again by the corpse, eyes narrowing. Something glinted beneath the skeleton's bent leg. Reaching down, he worked it free. A dagger-like blade, long and narrow, forged from the same unearthly alloy as the augmentations. The edge shimmered even in the weak light, and the hilt bore more of those alien symbols, this time unmistakably words. They were beautiful, terrible. He felt a faint vibration through the glove, a hum like a suppressed chant. This was not made by human hands, he whispered. The Arbites leaned in, their lumens flickering. What is it, Lord? Absalon said nothing. His fingers tightened on his staff. The servo-skull whirred closer, scanning the artifact, its red lens glowing brighter as if reacting to the blade's presence. Careful, Absalon murmured. Even relics remember. He straightened, holding the weapon reverently, his expression unreadable. The rain poured harder, hammering the umbraculum like iron nails. His servitor, standing motionless nearby, shifted on its piston legs as the reliquary box upon its back clicked open with a hiss of sanctified vapor. Absalon hesitated, then whispered a prayer of warding. The old words felt heavy in his mouth. Omnissiah witness me, Emperor preserve me, in knowledge sanctified, in ignorance shielded. He reached back, placing the blade into the reliquary with steady, deliberate care. The servo-skull dimmed its light. The Arbites said nothing. The fugitive stared in horror and fascination. Absalon adjusted his robes and turned to the officer. You will seal this place, he said. No one digs here without the authority of the Adeptus Ministorum or Archmagos Veratrix herself. Am I clear? Yes, Lord, the officer said quickly. Absalon gave a slow nod, though his gaze remained fixed on the rain-dark horizon. Somewhere beyond it, the storm rolled toward the coast, and beneath the earth, something long buried had stirred. Straightening, Deacon Absalon turned to the trembling priest. You are dismissed, he said evenly. The fugitive's mouth opened as if to protest, then shut again. Bowing several times in frantic succession, he muttered broken invocations to the god emperor and stumbled away down the muddy path, his robes plastered with filth. His retreating form soon vanished into the curtain of rain. Absalon then turned his gaze to the Arbites officer. Your men will remain here until reinforcements arrive. Then you are dismissed. The officer stiffened, rain cascading off his helm. Lord, this must be investigated. It will be, Absalon interrupted, his voice calm but firm as iron. The officer hesitated, hand resting on his sidearm. Look, priest, this is a security matter and he broke off as the sound of boots and shouted orders echoed up the slope. A squad of Fraterus militia appeared, their red robes muddied to brown, weapons held ready. Their leader was a heavy-set prelate in battered carapace armor, a man Absalon knew well. His presence meant the Ministorum network had acted with its usual speed. One of the Arbites stepped forward, hand raised, ready to assert his jurisdiction, only to be drowned out by the sudden roar of engines overhead. The sky split with light as a Thunderhawk gunship descended through the storm, its engines shaking the ground. Its hull bore the storm-blue markings of the Void Revenants. The Arbites officer flinched instinctively, his authority washing away in the shriek of descent thrusters. Below, the Mechanicus adepts who had been working the trenches scrambled to clear a landing zone. Their servitors froze mid-task, their logic cores locked between duty and fear. The gunship hovered, then set down hard in a wash of steam and rain. At the same moment, a jet bike slid to a halt at the edge of the path. Its rider, a tall woman in black carapace armor, dismounted with graceful precision. She removed her helm, setting it upon the bike's hull, and from a small satchel drew a wide-brimmed hat, which she placed carefully upon her head before striding forward through the downpour. Inquisitor Katerina Malinovska. Her pale face was calm, her expression unreadable. The Arbites officer's hand fell away from his holster, his confidence evaporating. He looked like a man who had just been reminded of his place in the Emperor's hierarchy. Katerina inclined her head toward him with a polite smile that somehow carried more weight than any threat. Officer, she said lightly, you've done your duty. I'll take it from here. Then, turning to Absalon, she nodded once in genuine respect. Deacon, so what's the emergency? Before Absalon could answer, a squad of Gastelm approached from the gunship, armored Astartes warriors, their white helms streaked with rain. At their head strode runesmith Osric, grin splitting his scarred features, his power axe resting casually on one shoulder. Beside him, the towering form of Second Captain Toonbald moved with deliberate, measured purpose, his storm cloak snapping in the wind. The Arbites officer paled further, his earlier defiance dissolving entirely at the sight of the Inquisition and the Angels of Death. He gave a short, resigned nod. Happy to be of service, he muttered. Absalon turned back toward the gaping mouth of the pipe. Rain ran down his cowl, darkening the fabric to the color of blood. His face was expressionless, but behind his eyes thoughts turned like grinding gears. Whatever secrets lay beneath the soil of Nitwertha, they were far older and far darker than he had anticipated. For a moment, he looked out across the storm-lashed horizon, and the world he loved so dearly seemed to shift beneath him. What had once been a place of safety now felt watched, like a cold, vast god had turned its gaze upon it, and upon him. He folded his arms, letting the feeling pass, and turned back toward his gathered audience. The Arbites, the militia, the Inquisition, and the towering Astartes of the Void Revenants. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, then glanced toward Katerina, and "Lady," he gestured toward the pipe, where the lumen beams still illuminated the silver skull and its alien blade. "We appear to have a body."